In the middle of a multi-million-dollar supercar unveiling, Jessica laughed seeing her ex-husband, Mason, step out from the repair bay with grease staining his hands. She mocked him in front of colleagues and the chief executive, calling him nothing but a broke mechanic who did not belong. Mason said nothing back. He simply stared at the engine shuddering in a way it never should, then ordered everyone to step away. Seconds later, smoke poured out, the frame locked solid, and the executive turned pale with fear. What truly froze Jessica was watching that powerful man bow before Mason. Stay until the end to discover why the man everyone mocked truly held the entire company's fate in his hands. 3 days before that unveiling, Mason Hayes was exactly where he wanted to be, bent over the open hood of an aging sedan inside Hayes Auto Works, a small shop tucked into an old industrial stretch on the edge of Detroit. His coveralls were a faded charcoal gray, worn thin at the elbows, and his boots carried the permanent memory of 1,000 oil changes. He worked with the quiet precision of a man who trusted his hands more than his words, checking a belt tension, listening for a knock in the engine that most drivers would never notice. Customers around the neighborhood trusted him for a simple reason. He never replaced a part that did not need replacing, never padded an invoice, and often fixed small safety issues for free without mentioning it to anyone. None of the regulars who brought him their trucks and family cars had any idea that the quiet man in the bay had once been one of the most gifted propulsion engineers in the American automotive industry. Above the shop floor, behind a locked door that none of his employees had a key to, sat a private room that told a different story entirely. Inside were the original schematics for a drivetrain system called Vector Pulse, patent filings bearing his name, founding shares in a corporation called Sterling Vector, and a black metal access card granting entry to the highest levels of that corporation's headquarters. A framed photograph sat on the workbench inside that hidden room, showing a much younger Mason standing beside an early prototype chassis, grinning in a way none of his current customers would recognize. He had built that technology with his own hands years earlier, then walked away from the spotlight on purpose, choosing grease and quiet mornings over boardrooms and cameras. He believed an engineer who never got dirty eventually forgot what the machine was for. That week, an invitation arrived through an old friend and business partner named Joseph Sterling, asking Mason to attend the unveiling of a new flagship supercar called the Vortex X. Joseph mentioned, almost in passing, that the final testing data showed a strange irregularity, though the operations director insisted it was nothing more than a faulty sensor reading. Mason declined to attend as a founding shareholder. Instead, he asked to come in as an outside contractor, unnamed and unnoticed, so he could watch how the company actually behaved when nobody in the room knew who he really was. Around the same time, a senior safety engineer named Amelia Carter quietly sent Mason a file she was not supposed to share. It showed battery temperatures and engine bay pressure readings that did not match the original design tolerances he had approved years earlier. Mason studied the numbers late into the night and recognized immediately that someone had substituted the insulation material he had specified for something cheaper and far less stable. He decided to go to headquarters before the unveiling, not to reclaim any title or recognition, but because a machine behaving like that one was a danger waiting for an audience. Reading through the guest list Joseph had forwarded him, Mason paused on one name near the top of the event committee. It was Jessica Blake, his ex-wife. He had not stood in the same room as her in nearly 4 years, not since the marriage ended, and she walked into a version of success he had never wanted for himself. He closed the file, set his tools down for the night, and allowed himself one long breath before locking the shop behind him. Mason and Jessica had met years earlier, back when neither of them had any status to speak of. He was a test engineer who spent most of his hours underneath prototype vehicles, and she was a communications assistant just starting to climb the corporate ladder. In those early years, Jessica loved his patience, his steady hands, and the way he could fix almost anything without ever raising his voice. She used to say he made her feel safe in a way none of the polished men at industry events ever had. When Mason and Joseph founded Sterling Vector together, Mason made a deliberate choice to keep his own name out of the public record. He worried that investors would try to strip safety features out of his designs the moment they knew how much control he actually held, and he wanted to keep working directly on the machines rather than sitting behind a desk defending them. He signed an agreement letting Joseph serve as the public face of the company while he stayed in the background, testing engines with his own 2 hands. A patent dispute unfolding quietly at the time made him even more cautious about revealing his role, and he never gave Jessica the full picture of what he was protecting or why. All Jessica saw night after night was a husband coming home in oil-stained clothes, turning down invitations to formal dinners, and receiving quiet phone calls he never fully explained. As her own career advanced, she began to feel a creeping embarrassment whenever Mason stood beside her at company functions, dressed like a man who worked with his hands instead of one who ran anything. A rising operations director named Jason Reed noticed her discomfort and slowly fed it, suggesting more than once that Mason was nothing but a technician Joseph kept around out of old-fashioned loyalty and pity. Jason was careful never to attack Mason outright. Instead, he planted small remarks over lunches and after meetings, wondering aloud within earshot of Jessica why a man with real talent would waste his life under a car when he could be sitting in a boardroom instead. Each remark landed like a splinter, small enough to ignore on its own but impossible to remove once enough of them had gathered beneath the surface. By the time Jessica finally confronted her husband, she was no longer entirely sure which doubts were her own, and which had been handed to her by a man who wanted her exactly where he could use her. Their marriage reached its breaking point the night Jessica asked Mason to leave the shop behind and find, in her words, work more befitting of who she believed he could become. Mason refused, telling her plainly that work done with one's hands was never beneath anyone. Jessica walked away from that conversation convinced her husband lacked ambition and was quietly holding her back from the life she wanted. She filed for divorce soon after, and Jason was there to elevate her career almost immediately, eventually helping her rise to vice president of communications within a few short years. Mason never contested the divorce, never disclosed his shares in the company, and never used his influence to interfere with her new position. Still, his silence had been part of the problem all along, a wall Jessica had never managed to see past during their years together. He understood long after the papers were signed that a marriage cannot survive on trust alone if one partner is never given the full truth to trust in the first place. He had told himself for years that protecting his work meant protecting her too, but standing alone in the quiet shop each night, he began to wonder if he had simply protected himself instead. 3 days before the unveiling, she received a routine notice that an outside technician would be inspecting the Vortex X ahead of the event, never once suspecting that the technician listed was the same man she had once shared a home with. Mason arrived at the Sterling Vector Development Center in his old pickup truck, a vehicle far more suited to hauling parts than parking among the polished sedans in the executive lot. The guard at the front gate tried to hold him outside, since his name did not appear on the standard vendor list, but Mason made no attempt to flash any authority. He simply asked the guard to call Amelia down to confirm his credentials, and she arrived within minutes, quietly vouching for him without asking a single question. Jessica spotted him in the reception area almost immediately, and the contrast between them could not have been sharper. She wore a tailored suit fitted for cameras and investor meetings, while Mason stood there in work coveralls, a battered metal toolbox in one hand. She assumed, instantly and without hesitation, that he had shown up on the most important day of her career purely to embarrass her in front of international clients and executives. She told him flatly that he had no business appearing looking like that in front of the people who mattered most to her future. Mason answered calmly that he had not come for her at all. He had come for the car. Jason appeared moments later, recognizing Mason immediately but choosing to treat him with the same dismissive tone he might use for any outside mechanic. He instructed Mason that he was permitted only to observe from a distance and was under no circumstances to touch any part of the control systems. In the testing bay, working carefully and without drawing attention to himself, Mason noticed a fresh weld along the battery enclosure, a material batch code that did not match the official records, and a thermal sensor that had clearly been recalibrated to report readings lower than the actual temperature. He also found 3 load-bearing bolts that had been swapped for a cheaper grade entirely unsuited to the stresses the vehicle would face. She showed Mason the email chain where she had flagged the mismatched thermal readings weeks earlier, only to receive a curt reply from Jason insisting the readings fell within acceptable tolerance and that further testing would delay a launch date already promised to investors. Amelia admitted quietly that she had already reported every one of these issues, only to have Jason dismiss her concerns in order to keep the unveiling on schedule. Mason requested that the event be postponed until the vehicle could be properly inspected. Jason laughed the request off, telling him a neighborhood mechanic had no authority to delay a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Jessica sided with Jason without hesitation, convinced that Mason was using their old relationship to sabotage an event she had spent months preparing. Mason looked directly at her and asked whether she was truly willing to gamble hundreds of lives just to protect an image. She hesitated for a moment, something flickering behind her eyes, but still gave the order for security to escort him out of the testing bay. Before he left, Mason managed to slip a scorched fragment of the insulation material into his pocket. He recognized the batch instantly. It belonged to a material line that had been banned years earlier for igniting under high heat conditions, a detail buried deep in a safety report almost nobody outside his own old engineering circle would remember. Mason carried the fragment back to his shop and ran it through an old spectrometer he had built himself years earlier, long before anyone at Sterling Vector had ever heard his name. The results confirmed what he already suspected. The material could withstand barely 2/3 of the heat threshold the design required. Later that evening, Amelia arrived quietly at the shop carrying a copy of the original testing data, the version recorded before Jason had it altered. Together they laid the numbers side by side and found at least 7 separate heat warnings that had been deleted from the official file, along with a digital signature belonging to Amelia that had clearly been copied without her consent. Neither of them could find any record of the approved supplier ever shipping the components currently installed on the vehicle. Amelia pulled up procurement records on her laptop, tracing a chain of invoices that led back to a supplier neither of them had ever heard of before that week. The company had been registered barely a year earlier, listed no verifiable factory address, and had never once appeared in any of Sterling Vector's approved vendor documentation. Mason worked through the connections methodically and concluded that Jason had funneled purchases through this shell company to acquire cheap materials, then build the corporation as though premium components had been used the entire time. The difference in cost alone suggested a scheme worth more than $18 million. Far more dangerous than the money, though, was the physical reality of what they were looking at. The vector pulse system could overcompress energy dangerously if its insulation layer failed, and an explosion inside a crowded unveiling hall could kill dozens of people in seconds. Mason tried calling Joseph directly, but the call was rerouted by an assistant working under Jason who claimed the chief executive was locked in a closed-door meeting. Refusing to wait, Mason used his founder-level access card to open an offline data vault and discovered something even more troubling. Jason had already prepared a plan to shift full technical responsibility onto Amelia the moment anything went wrong, ensuring his own name stayed clear of any investigation. Jason, meanwhile, learned that Mason had taken a sample of the material and sent people to break into the shop that same night, hoping to recover a copy of the original patent filings and destroy the independent testing equipment stored there. Mason returned just after the intrusion and found the back door forced open, the workstation stripped of its hard drive. Rather than confront anyone directly, he photographed a shoe print left near the doorway, checked an independent mechanical camera that ran on its own separate power source, and passed everything he found to Lucas Grant, the head of corporate security. Lucas quickly traced the intruder to a private security contractor with financial ties leading straight back to Jason. Joseph finally returned the call late that night. Mason urged him not to cancel the unveiling outright, warning that doing so would only give Jason time to destroy whatever evidence remained. The two agreed that the event should proceed, but only with the vehicle running in a fully locked, non-operational mode, while Lucas quietly gathered documentation behind the scenes. Jason overheard just enough of that conversation through a compromised phone line to realize his window was closing, and he made the decision to activate the Vortex X live in front of hundreds of guests, forcing Mason into a choice between guarding his own hidden identity and stopping a disaster before it began. On the morning of the unveiling, the Sterling Vector headquarters filled with investors, journalists, international dealers, senior engineers, and members of the board of directors. The Vortex X sat at the center of a rotating stage beneath a wall of high-powered lights, gleaming like something built for a museum rather than a road. Jessica oversaw the entire live broadcast from a booth near the back of the hall, checking camera angles and confirming that every microphone was live and ready, running through the schedule in her head one final time before the lights came up on the stage. Without warning, Jason announced that the vehicle would be started and put through a full demonstration of the vector pulse system. Amelia objected immediately, but Jason had her forcibly removed from the control station before she could reach the shutdown switch. Mason stepped out from a technical corridor at the side of the stage and demanded that the demonstration be stopped at once. Jason asked loudly, for the benefit of everyone watching, exactly what authority a man like him could possibly claim to have. Mason answered simply that he understood that system well enough to know it was about to fail. Jessica, worried that Mason was about to wreck her reputation in front of the exact people whose respect she had spent years earning, stepped forward to intervene. In front of hundreds of guests, she brought up old grievances from their marriage, telling the crowd that Mason had never been willing to change, that he still hid inside that same shop, still wore the same oil-stained clothes he had worn years earlier. She laughed and told him he was still just a grease-stained mechanic, and that he should stop pretending he belonged anywhere near a room like that one. A ripple of laughter spread through part of the audience, and for a moment Mason simply stood there, letting the sound wash over him without flinching. He had heard versions of that same laugh before, at dinners and launch parties years earlier, and it no longer carried the sting it once had. What mattered now was not what these people believed about him, but what was happening underneath the car in front of them. Mason did not answer with anger. Instead, his eyes moved to the temperature display glowing on the stage monitor, and he saw the number climbing in a pattern he recognized immediately as dangerous. He asked Jessica calmly whether she knew who had designed the small triangular symbol printed on the control panel. She admitted she did not. Mason told her that symbol marked the emergency pressure release valve, and that the valve had been installed backward. Jason immediately ordered security to drag Mason away from the stage. Joseph walked into the hall at that exact moment, but before he could say a word, Jason activated the full system anyway, determined to prove Mason wrong in front of everyone watching. A low, heavy boom sounded from beneath the vehicle's frame. The doors of the Vortex X locked automatically, the entire stage shuddered under the guests' feet, and thick gray smoke began pouring out from around the battery enclosure, drifting toward the very rows of seats where the most important guests of the evening were sitting. The control screens went dark almost instantly, and panic rippled through the crowd as they realized the Vortex X sat directly beneath the lighting rig and only a short distance from the nearest rows of seats. Jason tried to insist it was merely a cooling effect, but Amelia shouted over him that the actual internal temperature had already crossed well past any safe threshold. Mason ran the numbers in his head and understood they had roughly 3 minutes before the battery enclosure reached a full chain reaction. He began issuing instructions without hesitation. He told Joseph to evacuate the eastern section of the hall immediately, asked Amelia to cut power to the stage, and had Lucas throw open the fire doors along the side wall. He warned the arriving fire crew not to spray water directly into the battery compartment under any circumstances. A few people hesitated at first, uncertain why they should follow orders from a man with no listed title, but Joseph settled the question by shouting for everyone to do exactly what Mason said, without argument and without delay. Mason dropped to the floor beneath the vehicle as heat and smoke rolled outward around him. There he found that Jason had removed the original mechanical release valve entirely, replacing it with a cheaper electronically controlled part. With the power now cut, that replacement valve had no way to open on its own. Working quickly, Mason grabbed a torque wrench, a length of steel pulled from the stage framework, and a grounding cable ripped free from the lighting rig, using them together to force open a temporary pressure release without breaching the battery casing itself. Somewhere behind him, a member of the catering staff had frozen mid-step with a tray still balanced in her hands, watching the smoke curl upward past the lighting rig, and Mason called out without looking up, telling her calmly to walk, not run, toward the nearest fire door. Jason attempted to slip away through a side exit, but Lucas caught him before he reached the door. Jessica stood frozen nearby, watching the same man she had mocked only minutes earlier absorb blistering heat to protect people who had just laughed in his face. A bolt beneath the frame snapped loose and tore open a gash along Mason's forearm. Yet he kept working, calling out for Amelia to read him the exact temperature readings as they shifted. The two of them moved in practiced rhythm, easing the pressure down in careful, deliberate stages. Just seconds before the system would have reached its breaking point, the valve finally released, sending the superheated gas safely into a containment conduit built beneath the stage rather than out toward the crowd. A ragged cheer went up from the fire crew standing near the containment barrier, quickly followed by a hush as everyone realized how close the entire hall had come to catastrophe. The temperature began falling steadily. Mason emerged from beneath the vehicle covered in soot, blood running from his torn forearm, his expression as calm as it had been the moment he first walked into the hall. Nobody in that room was laughing anymore. Jessica took a step toward him, but Joseph reached first, removing his glasses, bowing low from the waist, and speaking words that silenced the entire hall completely. Joseph straightened up slowly and said, in a voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear, that he was sorry, calling Mason by a title none of them had ever expected. Jessica stood frozen, asking Joseph directly why he had just addressed a mechanic in coveralls with that kind of respect. Joseph did not hesitate before telling the truth in front of everyone present. Mason was the man who had designed the vector pulse system from the ground up. He held the core patent that every vehicle in the company's premium lineup depended on, and he had co-founded Sterling Vector alongside Joseph 12 years earlier, holding a stake large enough to block any decision touching engineering or safety standards. Joseph explained almost gently that he had not bowed because of money or shares. He had bowed because Mason once saved the company's very first project from total collapse, had turned down an enormous offer from a rival corporation looking to buy the design and strip out its safety standards, and had used his own dividends during a difficult financial period to keep hundreds of workers employed. Mason continued showing up at the shop every day because he believed an engineer who built machines needed to understand the people who repaired them with their own hands. The oil stains on his clothes were never a symbol of failure. They were simply the uniform of the work he had chosen for himself. Joseph added that in 12 years of running the company together, he had never once seen Mason ask for a headline, a bonus, or a seat at the head of any table, and that this quiet consistency was worth more to him than any balance sheet the corporation had ever produced. Jessica's mind raced backward through years of small, unexplained details. Late-night calls from Joseph. Blueprints Mason always kept locked away. The times he vanished without warning to inspect some distant plant. The quiet, unmistakable respect older engineers had always shown him, respect she had never understood the reason for. Jason, cornered and furious, accused Joseph and Mason of staging the entire disaster to pin blame on him unfairly. Lucas responded by projecting a series of documents onto the nearest screen showing falsified contracts, money routed through a shell company, security footage of the break-in at the shop, and proof that Amelia's digital signature had been altered without her knowledge. Amelia confirmed in a steady voice that Jason had pressured her more than once into approving results that never should have passed inspection. Mason made it clear he was not interested in punishing Jason for the insult aimed at him personally. He wanted Jason held accountable because he had knowingly put human lives at risk to protect his own profit. Security led Jason out of the hall in handcuffs while Jessica stood alone at the center of the stage, slowly realizing that the entire foundation of the career she took such pride in had been built on technology created by a man she had spent years quietly looking down on. Before the crowd could fully process what they had just witnessed, Mason turned to face the board of directors and told them the danger was far from over. More than 400 additional test vehicles across the country were likely running on the exact same falsified components. The board of directors met in an emergency session within hours, worried that a full recall would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and send the stock price into a steep decline. One board member argued that customers rarely notice slow, quiet fixes handled through routine service appointments, and that drawing public attention to the flaw would only invite lawsuits the company might otherwise avoid. Several members suggested quieter alternatives, urging the company to keep the incident contained, replace parts only on vehicles that had not yet shipped, or place the entire blame squarely on Jason and move on as quickly as possible. Mason rejected all of it. He argued that Jason's individual crimes were his own responsibility, but a management structure that ignored repeated safety warnings belonged to the entire organization, not to one man alone. Using his founder-level technical authority, Mason insisted on a full recall of every affected vehicle, complete public disclosure of the danger involved, an independent safety review conducted by outside inspectors, compensation for the legitimate supplier whose identity had been fraudulently used, and formal protection for Amelia and every other employee who had tried to raise the alarm. Joseph agreed to all of it, fully aware the decision might eventually cost him his own position as chief executive. Jessica was assigned to draft the public statement, and for the first time in her career she faced a genuine choice between protecting her own image and simply telling the truth. She wrote a statement acknowledging plainly that the company had allowed deadline pressure to override basic safety standards, and she included her own name among those who had dismissed early warnings without properly verifying them. The press conference that followed grew tense almost immediately, with reporters pressing Joseph on accountability, investors demanding Mason appear personally, and members of the public voicing anger over what the incident revealed about the company's internal culture. Mason chose not to stand in front of any camera to accept praise. Instead, he stayed in the workshop beside Amelia and the engineering team, personally helping design a corrected replacement assembly. That choice slowly began to shift public opinion in the company's favor. Workers across the industry noticed that the man with the most power inside the corporation had been the first one to crawl beneath a smoking vehicle and the last one to leave the shop floor each night. The stock price dipped sharply in the short term, but regulators publicly praised the voluntary recall, and customers chose to keep their existing orders once they saw how transparently the company had handled the crisis. Industry analysts noted, almost with surprise, that a company willing to admit fault so openly was rare enough to earn a kind of trust that no marketing campaign could ever manufacture on its own. Inside the workshop, none of that outside noise seemed to touch Mason at all. He simply moved from one vehicle to the next, checking every replacement part with the same careful attention he had given his very first engine years earlier. After the final press conference ended, Jessica drove alone to Mason's shop, arriving without an assistant, without a title to hide behind, and without a single camera following her through the door. Jessica stood inside the shop she had once considered a symbol of everything her ex-husband refused to become. Looking around slowly, she noticed things she had never bothered to see before. Photographs of neighborhood workers Mason had quietly helped over the years. Engineering awards stacked in a drawer instead of displayed on any wall. The original blueprints that had become the foundation of an entire corporation. Invoices marked down or waived entirely for customers who clearly could not afford full repairs. She admitted, quietly and without excuse, that she had spent years measuring a person's worth by their title, their wardrobe, and how the crowd around them reacted, rather than by anything real underneath. She also admitted something harder to say aloud. She had used Mason's silence as a convenient excuse for her own contempt, allowing herself to believe he simply did not matter because he never explained himself. Mason did not pretend to be blameless either. He acknowledged that he had kept too much from her over the years, that he had believed love should not require constant explanation, and that his own lack of honesty had helped build the distance that eventually broke them apart. He told her plainly that he had allowed her to live inside a marriage without ever truly knowing who she was sharing it with. He watched her study the drawer of unclaimed awards a moment longer, and something in his chest loosened slightly, not into forgiveness exactly, but into something closer to understanding. Still, Mason made one thing clear. His hidden identity did not excuse the way she had spoken to working people, including the way she had spoken to him in front of hundreds of strangers. Jessica said she was not apologizing because he turned out to be a founding shareholder of a major corporation. She was apologizing because she had once treated an honest trade as something shameful, and that judgment had nothing to do with money at all. She was not asking to rebuild what they once had together. Mason accepted her apology calmly, telling her that some doors, once closed, are better left that way, and that the two of them were not meant to return to who they used to be, no matter how much either one of them might have once wished otherwise. When Jessica asked whether she should resign from her position, Mason told her that decision was not his to make. He said she would have to prove any real change through the quality of her work when nobody was left in the room to applaud her for it. Before she left, she set her senior access card down on his workbench, as though offering to walk away entirely. Mason slid it back across the bench toward her, telling her she did not need to run from what she had done. She needed to stay and help repair the very damage she had once played a part in creating. Jessica walked out of the shop in silence, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked at the oil staining Mason's hands without feeling even a trace of the old embarrassment. She sat in her car in the empty lot for a long while before starting the engine, thinking not about what she had lost, but about the kind of person she still had time to become. 6 months later, Sterling Vector completed the entire recall without a single further incident. Joseph remained chief executive, but he created an independent safety board with Mason at its head. Amelia was promoted to chief safety engineer, holding full authority to halt any project that failed to meet standard. Jessica stayed on at a lower position she had accepted willingly, building a new initiative honoring the workers and technicians the company had always overlooked. Mason turned down a top-floor office, choosing instead to move his research team down beside the repair bay, where engineers and mechanics worked side by side. A new sign above the testing floor read that no hands were ever beneath anyone when they were busy protecting human lives. At the next unveiling, Mason simply listened to the engine, nodded once in approval, then walked quietly back to his shop, hands still stained with the only kind of pride he had ever needed, and no one in that room ever laughed at those stains again.